Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, February 12th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Kyrsten Sinema, the senator from Arizona who is a registered independent, and her prospects at a re-election bid, and why her decreasing numbers in terms of fundraising and election odds is really contributing to this narrative that she may not run for re-election and thus helping the Democratic Party quite tremendously. When you're taking a look at the state of Arizona, for context, this is a state that President Biden won in the last election by a margin of 0.3%. It was a very, very close and competitive race, and it was a state that hadn't been a swing state for quite some time. Only in the 2020 election did it really narrow up to be this state that could have been won by Democrats after voting for Republicans in every election since 1996. Now, the state of Arizona is also unique in that recent time frames, we've seen Democrats do quite well. If you're looking at 2018, during the midterm elections, during that span of the election period, the 2020 election, and even the most recent 2022 midterms, Democrats have done quite well. Now, I will first say that this Arizona Senate race is of a unique point of interest because of the possibility that it might be a three-way race. Because Kyrsten Sinema, the independent who was first elected as a Democrat back in 2018, actually, when she defeated then Representative Martha McSally by a margin of 2.4%, she switched over to the independent side of the aisle, I guess down to the middle, and Democrats still felt that they needed to field their own candidate. And so in this race, Ruben Gallego, a U.S. representative who currently represents the 3rd Congressional District, is now running for Senate, was running against Kyrsten Sinema when there was expectation that Sinema might be running for re-election as a Democrat here, and she was underperforming the polls, to put it lightly. She was getting around 6-7% when it came down to statewide numbers against Ruben Gallego, even at some point, 16-17%, at her best showing at 24% in a one-on-one race. So nothing that is super, super impressive on the Kyrsten Sinema front in the Democratic primary. And so when she switched over to be an independent, it fueled all this speculation that Republicans might be able to easily win this Arizona Senate election because Democrats would be seeing their votes split. Because Kyrsten Sinema had previously identified as an independent, there was no expectation that she was going to pull voters away from the Republican Party, and more so that she would pull them entirely away from the Democratic Party. But what we know now, based on polling data that's been released from the state in this potential hypothetical three-way race, is that it isn't as simple as that. Although Kyrsten Sinema was elected as a Democrat, she actually has a higher approval rating amongst Republicans than she does Democrats. A lot of Democrats are unhappy with her because she has been holding up the Democratic Party when it comes down to the United States Senate. She is vehemently opposed to removing the filibuster, and so she has been this thorn in the side of Democrats for quite some time alongside Joe Manchin, except the only difference is that Joe Manchin represents a Trump plus 40 state and Sinema represents a Biden state. But like I said, these polls didn't exactly reveal that a three-way race would be an ultimatum here, or an ultimate factor here, when it comes down to who wins the election. When you're looking at head-to-head races, for example, the most recent one from public policy polling, Kari Lake, the Republican expected nominee, who has received the endorsement from Donald Trump, was the 2022 nominee for governor in this state, very well known, very adored amongst the GOP, is at 46% to Ruben Gallego at 45%. In a three-way race, you find that Kyrsten Sinema pulls nearly equally from both Democrats and Republicans in this state, reducing down Ruben Gallego to 36%, Kari Lake to 35%, and Kyrsten Sinema at 17%. But one thing is consistent. There is no reality in which Kyrsten Sinema wins a three-way race in a two-party system. As an independent, you are alienating yourself, and the only independents who have really thrived and succeeded in this country as United States senators recently are Bernie Sanders and Angus King. And the only real reason that they are able to do so well is because more often than not, the Democratic coalition will coalesce around the independent rather than whoever their party puts up as the nominee, or in some instances, like we've seen in recent elections, Democrats won't even choose to nominate a candidate. They've tried this in red states too. In Utah, they backed Evan McConnell, who was a Republican who received the Democratic Party's endorsement, and they axed supporting any type of nominee on the Democratic front, and the race narrowed down to around 10 points, and sure, that's something that could have been effective for Kyrsten Sinema if she was liked by Democrats. If she had made this party movement and had been very respected amongst the Democratic Party electorate, she likely would have gotten the endorsement from the Arizona Democratic Party and would probably be in a better position today. But because she has taken so many stances against where the Democrats, have taken fundamental beliefs in, whether it comes down to changing the minimum wage through budget reconciliation, whether it comes down to abolishing the filibuster to ensure D.C. and Puerto Rico statehood, a lot of these factors at play here that Kyrsten Sinema seems to have been perceived as an obstructionist for have contributed in her decrease in support and her decrease in polling. Because what I will say was that when she was first elected to the Senate in 2018, she was seen as this rising star in Arizona politics and in national politics. She was the first bisexual woman elected to the United States Senate. She had broken many norms traditionally expected to be in the United States Senate. She had made a name for herself as someone who was a Green Party activist, who came into the Democratic Party as a blue dog, then came into the United States Senate as someone who was able to flip a state that historically had been so Republican and flip this Senate seat from red to blue in 2018. She had a success story coming her way. And so in just the span of around 6 years, it looks increasingly less likely that she is going to run for re-election. With her worst fundraising quarter in 3 years, many people raising doubts about her re-election. When you take a closer look as to how much money she actually has on hand, almost all of it is left over from fundraising that was done prior to her losing support amongst the Democratic Party. I mean, she has fundraised less than a few $1 million over the past quarter. That's not where you want to be in a state that is expected to see a whopping, $10, $20, $30 million expected on either side of the hand, taking a look on either side of the aisle. I think looking at where we are when it comes down to the state of Arizona, when it comes down to Kyrsten Sinema as an independent, she would need to be reeling in tens of millions of dollars at this rate in order to win this race. Arizona is not going to be an easy lift simply because she is the incumbent. In fact, you see that with the overwhelming majority of the voters in this state backing a different candidate, like Ruben Gallego, like Kari Lake. Kyrsten Sinema at this point is, fizzling off. And now even some polls are considering dropping her from the question entirely because it's becoming less and less likely that she does in fact run for re-election. So now here comes the good news for Democrats. If Kyrsten Sinema loses or decides not to run for re-election, that's really good for the Democratic Party. It means they will likely win this election because they are running against a Republican who Arizona voters have already rejected. Now, the polls might tell a story that say that this race is in fact competitive. But when we actually take a look at who's funding some of these polls, with the exception of the public policy polling that shows that a significant portion of the Arizona electorate is undecided, around 10%, you also find that a lot of the polls that are skewing the average here are ones that are funded by Kari Lake, with JL Partners, the most recent one, that shows her up by 2 in a head-to-head and up by 1 in a 3-way race. Or the America's PAC, which is a super PAC, which is a partisan sponsor for the Republican Party, went to the pollsters and said, hey, source this poll for me in Arizona that shows Kari Lake with a 6-point advantage. But when you take a look at Noble Predictive Insights, which, to be fair, did this poll back in October, so you're talking a few months away, Ruben Gallego, though, had a 6-point lead over Kari Lake and a 4-point lead over Mark Lamb, who at the time was considered to be a very strong contender for this race until Kari Lake started reeling in major endorsements. And the reason why I also just think that we are going to overestimate Kari Lake's support in this state is because of the 2022 governor's race, when Kari Lake was up by 4 points on Election Day, according to the polls. And considering the fact that in 2020, Joe Biden had been leading by 3, 4, 5, 6 points in the state of Arizona on Election Day, and you found that you saw a swing quite tremendous in favor of Donald Trump, and Republicans were saying if Kari Lake's up by 4, she's going to win by 10 because that's how the polls are gone, and they're wrong all the time, yada, 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 whatever the Republicans wanted to say in terms of an argument here. But Kari Lake lost. And it was a big wake-up call, I think, to Arizona Republicans that running this level of extremism in this state simply does not work. Kari Lake tried to embody Donald Trump in a way that turned off so many voters that Katie Hobbs, as a candidate who refused to debate, I kid you not, would not get on a debate stage with Kari Lake. You had Katie Hobbs, who refused to campaign in key and pivotal parts of the state, who was relatively absent in terms of presence, in terms of press, in terms of really anything when it came down to the final stretch of the campaign season. A lot of Democrats were looking at Arizona and saying, what the hell is going on when it comes down to Katie Hobbs? But it was a strategy, and it allowed Kari Lake to take up the oxygen and enter into the airwaves. And I'm sure Democrats could have run this campaign better. I'm sure that Katie Hobbs could have won this state by more. But it doesn't change the overall outcome, because Kari Lake, the closer and closer she got to the election, was starting to be perceived by more and more people and became less and less liked. It's sort of like the Ron DeSantis effect, that the more media oxygen you're taking up, the less the voters actually want of you. And so I think in the state of Arizona, you found that Kari Lake ruined her name, especially post-election. She took a page right out of the Donald Trump playbook here and refused to accept the results of her election. She said it was stolen by Katie Hobbs, that Democrats rigged Arizona just as they rigged the 2020 election. And to this day, she refuses to concede the 2022 governor's race. And so when we see somebody like her as the Republican nominee, and I see her up by 1 in the polls, I am frequently reminding myself of the 4-point lead she had on election day and the eventual loss she had when it came down to the state election. But Arizona is a little bit more blue when it comes down to national races. Remember the 2020 presidential? You might be thinking, okay, if Biden won it by 0.3, there's no chance that Democrats won it when it came down to a nationalized race in 2022. Well, not only did they win it, but Mark Kelly won it by 5 points against Blake Masters. And Blake Masters, in a very similar way, was endorsed by Donald Trump, represented the Trump wing of the Republican Party, was trying to embody him in this Arizona Senate race. And voters said, absolutely not. And so when you take a look at the election results, whether it's 2022 in the governor's race, 2022 in the Senate race, 2020 in the presidential race, 2020 in the Senate race, 2018 in the Senate race, the 2022 House races in the state of Arizona, where you found that Democrats did tremendously better than anyone even expected, you come in to realize that Arizona is not a state conducive to a Kari Lake Senate election, to a Kari Lake Senate bid. The Senate race in 2024 in the state of Arizona will be largely defined by the same exact factors that faced these candidates in 2022. The only difference is that Democrats are running Ruben Gallego, who quite frankly doesn't have a bad track record in Arizona and is a vetted candidate, served in the House for multiple terms. First elected in 2014 in a red wave year, Ruben Gallego made it in. Elected again in 16, then 18, then 20, then 22, and now he's running for Senate. And so when I look at this, I understand fully what is going to happen. I think this is a state where Democrats were very, very worried about this possibility that Sinema enters in. And as these numbers pour in, it looks much more likely that she will not enter into the race, and I think Democrats will be a lot better off for it. Because if it is Gallego and Lake, there will be this sensationalism around it, all this conversation around whether or not it will determine the balance of power, and I think for a while it will actually be competitive. But as we are starting to see on the presidential race, and as we saw in 2022, some ideologies simply do not make it to the finish line, and Kari Lake's is one of them. We have already started to see her walk back some of her comments. She's trying to take a more moderate approach when it comes down to pressing issues in Arizona, especially issues that are very salient right now, issues like abortion. She's trying to walk back some of her extremely restrictive and, quite frankly, bad pro-life takes when it comes down to abortion for a state like Arizona. Arizona is not this ruby red state that Republicans just fail to win. It's a swing state, one that now leans more blue than it does red. And so Kari Lake really needs to do some major character, revelation, I guess, or redo in this state if she has any chance at winning the Senate race, because voters more often than not will not take back a repeat candidate. Which is why it's very interesting to see that now, with Kari Lake back on the ballot in 2024, with Donald Trump back on the ballot in 2024, I think a lot of voters are going to get deja vu here, because it's going to be like they've seen this election before. And I think you will find that if it comes to November and Biden is in a better position than he is today, and Biden wins the election, there's no chance that Kari Lake does. And so Ruben Gallego, as the Democratic nominee, who was outpolling Kyrsten Sinema, outpolling everybody else in the race, was doing tremendously better. Even in a multi-way race, he was going to be the nominee, who has raised $13 million to date, with $6.5 million on hand. Kari Lake is raising money too, but not nearly to the same extent. She has $1 million on hand. She has $2 million raised. And honestly speaking, when you take a look at some of these endorsements that Kari Lake has received, very few U.S. senators, very few U.S. representatives, very few people when it comes down to the state of Arizona. She's gotten it from Blake Masters. She's gotten it from Turning Point Action. She did get it from Donald Trump, which is very, very important. But I think the lack of enthusiasm for her in specific as a candidate is going to pose a problem. Because it means that come the general election, the NRSC, the RNC may not be investing into this race the way they might be if it wasn't Kari Lake. Republicans are going to truly see the test of time here, where they can't nominate the same candidates they tried in 18, 20, 22, and I think this time around might be the wake-up call that they need to realize that running MAGA candidates, running Trump-adjacent candidates simply is not the way to win. And with Sinema more than likely out of the race, it now calls into question, does Kari Lake need to be this GOP nominee? But if Kyrsten Sinema all of a sudden surprises us, shocks the nation, and announces a re-election bid, maybe she can win. But without her, I think Kari Lake's chances are slim to none. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.